A house filled with billion-dollar art is still a tomb if the person you love treats you like a statue. Zaraya Kwon realized this chilling truth as she fastened the heavy clasp of her diamond necklace, the cold stones resting against her skin like an icy promise. Watching her reflection in the vanity mirror, the woman staring back looked like a sapphire set in stone. Her voluminous curls were a dark halo around a face sculpted by tension, her eyes shadowed with a smoke that matched the smoldering resentment in her heart. The royal blue silk of her gown clung to her like a second skin, the plunging neckline a deliberate strike against the month-long famine of her husband's touch. Blue, the color of depth, of ice, of the calm before a storm. Kwon Ti-hyun hadn't looked at her properly in 30 days. She had counted every single one. Their glass-walled skyscraper had become a mausoleum of unspoken words, each room echoing with the heavy weight of the conversations they were no longer having. He had retreated into a shell of professional courtesy since the night of the gala, perfecting the art of existing in the same space as if she were a ghost. Breakfast was a solitary affair while he was already at the office. Late nights stretched past midnight as he avoided their shared bed. Messages were delivered through his assistant with a cold politeness that felt like a blade to the heart. It was a kind of courtesy you'd extend to a stranger in a crowded elevator, and it was driving her to the brink of insanity. Tonight, however, the silence would break. The charity auction had been circled on her calendar for weeks, a reminder of a life where she was more than just a trophy kept under glass. Hello, family. Before we continue, I would like to know where you are watching from. Drop it in the comments and also subscribe to this channel. Now let's go back into the story. Zaraya stood, her heels clicking against the marble with the precision of a soldier's march as she descended toward the foyer. She could feel him before she saw him, the weight of his gaze, heavy as a physical touch, pinning her to the grand staircase. Ti-hyun stood in the shadow of his study, arms crossed, his tailored black suit unable to hide the dangerous ink of a dragon's tail creeping up the side of his neck. "Take off that dress," he said, his voice cutting through the 30-day silence like a serrated blade. It was low, dangerous, and edged with a feral possessiveness she hadn't felt in a lifetime. "You're not leaving this house tonight." Zaraya paused, her hand already gripping the ornate door handle, her body angled away but her heart hammering against her ribs like it was trying to escape. "Or what, Ti-hyun?" she challenged, meeting his intense stare without flinching. "Will you go back to pretending I'm a ghost? Because I'm tired of haunting this palace alone." The silence in the penthouse was a physical weight, a thick blanket of unspoken words that had stifled the air for 30 long days. Zaraya's heels clicked sharply against the white marble of the foyer, the sound echoing upward like a rhythmic challenge to the man she knew was watching. She didn't turn back. She didn't hesitate. Her focus was entirely on the heavy, gold filigreed handle of the front door, the only thing standing between her and a night where she could finally breathe again. Her fingers were inches from the cool metal when the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The shadow in the periphery of her vision shifted, and suddenly, the doorway to the study was no longer empty. Kwon Ti-hyun stood there, silhouetted against the dim amber glow of his office. He didn't move toward her, yet his presence filled the entire foyer, a dark, immovable force that made the expansive room feel suddenly small. His arms were crossed over his chest, the fabric of his tailored black suit straining slightly against his shoulders. He looked every bit the high-powered executive, but the mask was slipping. Above the crisp white line of his collar, the black ink of his dragon tattoo seemed to come alive. As he ground his teeth, the muscles in his jaw corded and flexed, making the dragon's tail pulse against his throat. It was a silent warning, a visual manifestation of the simmering fury he had kept under lock and key for a month. "Where do you think you're going, Zaraya?" His voice didn't rise, but it carried a lethal, serrated edge that cut through the stillness. It wasn't the voice of the businessman who had spent the last 4 weeks sending her messages through an assistant. It was the voice of the man who ruled Gwangju from the shadows. Zaraya's hand froze just a breath away from the handle. She took a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the royal blue silk of her dress stretch against her skin. She forced herself to turn, her voluminous curls shifting over her shoulders, her diamond earrings dancing in the prismatic light of the chandelier. She refused to look like a girl caught doing something wrong. She wanted him to see a woman who was done waiting. "I told your secretary," she replied, her tone deceptively light, though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "The charity auction. I'm already late, T. Hyun." His steady gaze dropped, tracing the plunging neckline of her gown with a dark, starving intensity that made her skin flush. The blank face he had perfected over the last 30 days was gone, replaced by a raw, feral possessiveness that he could no longer hide. He looked at her as if he wanted to devour her and destroy her all at once. "You're not going anywhere in that dress," he stated. It wasn't a request. It was a decree issued with the absolute authority of a king reclaiming his territory. Zaraya tilted her chin, her eyes flashing with a smoke-filled defiance. "You don't get to have an opinion on what I wear, T. Hyun. You lost that right somewhere around week 2 of your silent treatment. Move aside." She turned back to the door, her fingers finally closing around the ornate handle. But before she could pull, she heard the heavy, decisive thud of his footsteps. The air behind her surged with heat, and suddenly his shadow fell over her, pinning her against the door without even touching her. The scent of his expensive cologne and cold tobacco enveloped her, a sensory cage that was far more effective than any lock. "I said," he rasped, leaning down until his breath stirred the curls at the nape of her neck, "that you aren't leaving. Not tonight, not ever looking like that." The 30-day war was over. The ceasefire had ended. And as Zaraya felt the sheer, magnetic power of his proximity, she knew that the foyer had just become the front line of a battle she wasn't sure she wanted to win. Zaraya didn't flinch. She leaned back against the cool wood of the door, the ornate handle pressing into her lower back, and met his stormy gaze with a slow, provocative blink. Up close, the intensity of him was nearly suffocating. T. Hyun wasn't just a husband standing in her way. He was the Gwangju Syndicate's apex predator, and for the first time in 30 days, his focus was entirely, dangerously on her. "Funny," she whispered, her voice smooth and dripping with a honeyed sarcasm that masked her trembling nerves. "I didn't realize you still had a voice, T. Hyun. Based on the last month, I assumed you delegated all verbal communication to your secretary. Should I call Mr. Park and ask him if he's authorized this conversation?" T. Hyun's eyes darkened, the pupils blowing wide until they nearly swallowed the iris. He didn't answer. His gaze began a slow, agonizing descent, traveling from the defiant curve of her lips down to the hollow of her throat, where her pulse was jumping visibly. It continued downward, tracking the sharp plunge of the royal blue silk as it dipped toward her waist. It wasn't a look of judgment. It was a look of starving intensity. He looked like a man who had been wandering a desert and had finally stumbled upon a mirage he intended to make real. Every breath Zaraya took caused the fabric to shift and shimmer, and with every movement, the dragon tattoo on T. Hyun's neck seemed to coil tighter, mirroring the tension in his rigid frame. "You like it, don't you?" Zaraya taunted, emboldened by the raw hunger she saw in him. She shifted her weight, the movement causing the diamond drop earrings to brush against her neck. "I picked it out just for tonight. I figured since I was spending my evenings with a ghost, I might as well find someone at the auction who was still among the living to appreciate it." A low, guttural sound vibrated in T. Hyun's chest, half growl, half groan. He took a single step forward, closing the final inch of space between them until the heat radiating from his body soaked into the silk of her dress. He still hadn't touched her, but the air between them felt like it was humming with high-voltage electricity. "Do you have any idea?" He began, his voice dropping into a rasp that sent a shiver racing down her spine. How many men in that room would kill for the chance to put their hands where that silk is touching? You think I'm going to let you walk out of here and give them that satisfaction? "I think you've lost the right to care who looks at me," she retorted, though her voice lacked its earlier sting. Her breathing was becoming shallow as the scent of him, Leather, wood smoke, and that familiar, expensive musk filled her senses. You moved into the guest wing, remember? You're the one who turned this marriage into a transaction of emails and cold nods. If you wanted to be the only one to see me, you shouldn't have spent 30 days pretending I didn't exist. She went a push past him, her hand landing on the crisp, expensive wool of his suit jacket. The contact was electric. For a month, they had danced around each other like strangers in an elevator, and now the simple touch of her palm against his chest felt like a detonator being pressed. Tae-hyun didn't move. He remained as immovable as the skyscraper they lived in, his gaze anchored to the swell of her chest as it rose and fell with her agitated breathing. The polished boss was gone. In his place stood a man who was done being polite, a man whose restraint was fraying at the edges like a worn cable under too much weight. The emails were a mistake, he admitted, the words sounding like they were being torn from his throat. But the silence was the only thing keeping me from doing exactly what I'm about to do now. He raised his hand, his long, elegant fingers hovering just an inch from the royal blue silk, his shadow swallowing her whole. The foyer, once a grand entrance to their life together, now felt like a cage, and Zaraya realized with a jolt of terrifying heat that she didn't want the door to open anymore. Tae-hyun's hand didn't just move, it conquered. His fingers finally bridged the agonizing gap, his palm flattening against the cold gold of the door handle just above Zaraya's grip, effectively locking her in place. The proximity was a physical assault on her senses. She could feel the rhythmic thrum of his heart through the layers of their clothing, a rapid, heavy beat that betrayed the calculated stillness of his face. The air in the foyer, once vast and airy, had vanished, replaced entirely by the scent of him, sandalwood and the metallic tang of something dark and dangerous. Zaraya tilted her head back, her natural curls brushing against his chest, refusing to look away even as his shadow completely eclipsed her. The diamond necklace at her throat felt like a collar, heavy and hot, as his gaze burned into hers with a focus so singular it felt like being held at gunpoint. "You've been playing a very dangerous game, Zaraya," he rasped, his voice vibrating through her spine. He leaned in until his lips were a mere breath away from the shell of her ear. The dragon on his neck seemed to shift with the movement of his throat as he swallowed. "You thought if you dressed like a siren and walked toward the exit, I would just watch you go, that I would let you take that beauty into a room full of jackals." Zaraya's breath hitched, but she forced a jagged laugh. "You watched me for 30 days, Tae-hyun. You watched me eat alone. You watched me sleep alone. What's one more night of watching?" His response was a sudden, sharp invasion of her personal space. He moved his free hand to her waist, his fingers digging into the royal blue silk, pulling her flush against the rigid line of his body. The contact was a shock of high-voltage electricity that made her knees weaken. He wasn't the polished boss anymore. He was a man who had reached his breaking point, the careful discipline of the Kwon lineage finally snapping under the weight of a month's worth of repressed desire and territorial fury. "The watching is over," he growled, his eyes darkening to a shade of black that looked like midnight over the Gwangju docks. He looked down at the plunging neckline of her gown, his jaw cording so tightly she thought it might break. The hunger in his expression was raw, unedited, and terrifyingly honest. "I spent a month trying to convince myself I could live without the sound of your voice. I spent a month trying to protect you from the parts of me that are currently screaming to tear this city apart just to keep you safe." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, his eyes never leaving hers. The dominance he radiated was absolute, a silent command that required no shouting. "Take off that dress," he commanded, the titular line falling from his lips like a heavy iron chain. It wasn't a suggestion, and it wasn't an invitation. It was an order issued by a man who had realized that his silence had nearly cost him his crown. "You're not leaving this house tonight. You're not giving another man even a second of your time, not when I am starving for all of it." Zaraya felt the world outside the front door, the charity auction, the cameras, the society she had tried to flee to simply ceased to exist. There was only the heat of his hand on her waist, the throb of the dragon tattoo against his pulsing jugular, and the realization that the ghost of soul had finally come back to life. "And if I refuse?" she whispered, though her fingers were already loosening their grip on the door handle. Tae-hyun's grip tightened, his thumb tracing the curve of her hip through the expensive fabric. "Then I will take it off for you, and we won't leave this foyer until you remember exactly whose name you carry." The defiance in Zariah's chest didn't vanish. It transformed. It became a flame that matched his own, a burning acknowledgement that the Cold War was over and the real battle, the one for the soul of their marriage, had just begun. She let go of the handle, her hand traveling up to rest against the ink on his neck, her fingers tracing the dragon's scales. "The door is locked, Tae-hyun," she breathed, her smoky eyes challenging him one last time. "Prove to me you're not a ghost." The heavy silence that had anchored them to the foyer floor for 30 days finally fractured, but it didn't shatter into peace. It dissolved into the raw, jagged truth. Tae-hyun's grip on Zariah's waist didn't loosen, but his forehead remained pressed against hers, his eyes closed as if he were trying to memorize the scent of her skin before the world ended. "The letter, Zariah," he rasped, the words catching in his throat. "I saw the envelope, the one addressed to your brother's estate in Marseille. I saw the request for your original birth certificate and the emergency travel documents." Zariah's heart skipped a beat, but not for the reason he expected. She felt a cold wash of realization. The shot she thought he'd fired 30 days ago wasn't about her talking to an old flame at the gala. It was about the lifeline she had tried to build because she thought he no longer wanted her. "You thought I was leaving," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't think it. I knew it," Tae-hyun countered, finally opening his eyes. They were bloodshot, filled with a vulnerability that looked entirely wrong on a man who controlled the most ruthless syndicate in Gwangju. "After the gala, after I saw you in that garden with him, you looked so light, so free. And then I find a letter asking for the papers you'd need to disappear back into your old life. To a life where there are no guards, no blood on the doorstep, and no husband who has to check the underside of his car every morning." He let out a sharp, self-deprecating breath. "I thought if I gave you the silence, if I moved into the guest suite, I was giving you the space to realize you couldn't leave. But every night I sat in that study, watching the security feed of your bedroom door, I was just waiting for the moment you'd walk out with a suitcase and never look back. I became a ghost because I couldn't bear the thought of being the man you were running from." Zariah felt the heat of tears stinging her eyes. She reached up, her fingers sliding into the dark, polished silk of his hair, forcing him to look at her. "Tae-hyun, you idiot. You brilliant, terrifying idiot." She let out a shaky breath, the royal blue silk of her dress rustling as she shifted closer. "I wasn't asking for travel documents to leave you. I was asking for them because I realized that if anything happened to you, if the Jian cartel actually managed to do what they've been threatening, I would be a ghost in this country. I have no standing here without you. I was securing my papers so I could stay by your side as a legal citizen, as your wife in every sense of the word, not just a guest in your penthouse." The dragon on Tae-hyun's neck seemed to still as he processed her words. The cording of his jaw vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, stunned disbelief. "You weren't going to Marseille." "I was bringing Marseille here," she corrected, her thumb tracing the line of his lower lip. "I was talking to Luke at the gala because his family handles the diplomatic channels. I was trying to find a way to make sure that no matter what blood was spilled on the docks, they couldn't take me away from you. I said I wanted a way out. Yes, a way out of the legal limbo that keeps me hidden in this apartment like a secret you're ashamed of." The realization hit Tae-hyun like a physical blow. The month of silence, the separate beds, the icy messages delivered through assistants, it had all been a war fought against a phantom. He had spent 30 days mourning a loss that hadn't happened, and in doing so, he had nearly created the very exit he feared. His hands moved from her waist to her face, his palms cupping her cheeks with a desperate, crushing tenderness. "I've spent a month in hell because I was too proud to ask you if you still loved me." And I spent a month in a tomb because I thought you had finally realized I wasn't worth the risk, Zaraya whispered. The weight of the misunderstanding hung between them. A heavy curtain finally pulled back to reveal the wreckage of their pride. Ti-Hyun didn't say another word. He didn't have to. He simply leaned down and captured her lips in a kiss that tasted of salt, desperation, and the fierce, rekindled fire of a man who had just been given his life back. As the diamonds on her neck caught the light, Zaraya realized the gala was long forgotten. The only auction happening tonight was the one where Ti-Hyun was buying back every second of the month they had lost. Ti-Hyun pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his hands sliding from her cheeks to her shoulders, his grip tight as if anchoring himself to the only truth he had left. The desperate heat of their kiss lingered in the air, but the shadow that crossed his face was cold and heavy. He looked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows where the lights of Gwangju flickered like fallen stars, beautiful yet treacherous. It wasn't just the fear of you leaving, Zaraya, he admitted, his voice a low vibration that seemed to come from the very marrow of his bones. There's a reason I didn't come to your room. There's a reason I couldn't even look at you properly. The Jian cartel. They haven't just been making threats. They've been collecting a blood toll. He turned slightly, pulling back the sleeve of his jacket to reveal a bandage wrapped tightly around his forearm, one he had kept hidden beneath the pristine lines of his black suit. Zaraya gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The polished boss had been bleeding in silence while she had been mourning a lack of attention. The docks have become a graveyard, Ti-Hyun continued, his gaze darkening. In the last 30 days, I've lost 12 men. Good men. Men with families. The Geons aren't playing by the old rules anymore. They're targeting anyone close to the Kwon lineage. Every time I looked at you, every time I sat across from you at breakfast, all I could see was a target on your back. I thought if I stayed away, if I made the world believe there was a rift between us, that I didn't care for you, that you were just a trophy I'd grown bored of, then they wouldn't see you as a way to get to me. He let out a jagged, bitter laugh that didn't reach his eyes. My silence wasn't a weapon used against you, Zaraya. It was a shield. I was trying to make you invisible. I thought if I treated you like a stranger, the Geons would treat you like one too. I was trying to protect the only thing in this world that hasn't been corrupted by the Syndicate, even if it meant I had to lose you in the process. Zaraya looked at the bandage, then up at the dragon tattoo on his neck, which seemed to pulse with the weight of the secrets he had been carrying. She felt a surge of fierce, protective rage, not at him, but for him. He had been fighting a war on the docks by night and a war of the heart by day, all while maintaining a mask of cold indifference to keep her safe. You were fighting them alone, she whispered, her fingers gently brushing the fabric over his wound. You were carrying the weight of 12 lives and the fear of mine, and you thought the best way to handle it was to shut me out. I'm a soldier, Zaraya, he said, his jaw cording again. In my world, when things get dangerous, you harden, you close the gates. You don't bring the person you love into the line of fire. But I'm already in the line of fire, Ti-Hyun, she countered, her voice gaining a sharp, unbreakable edge. I'm a Kwon. Whether you speak to me or not, the world knows who I am. You didn't make me invisible, you just made me lonely and vulnerable. A shield is only strong when it's held by someone who isn't falling apart. You've been bleeding out in the dark while I was right here with the lights on, waiting for you to come home. She stepped back into his space, her royal blue gown rustling against his legs. She took his hand, the one that had blocked her exit only moments ago, and pressed it against her heart. No more noble silences, she commanded. The Geon cartel wants to take what's yours, then they have to deal with what's ours. I am not a secret to be kept, and I am not a prize to be protected. I am your wife. If there is a blood toll at the docks, I want to know about it. If there is a threat to our house, I want to see it coming. Ti-Hyun looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in a month, the ghost of Seoul saw the warrior he had married. The royal blue silk wasn't just a provocation anymore, it was armor. The Geons think they've found a weakness in my silence, he rasped, his eyes finally clearing of the fog of fear. They have no idea what they've unleashed by making me speak again. Zaraya stepped away from the door, the gold handle finally forgotten as she moved back into the center of the foyer. The royal blue silk of her gown trailed behind her like a regal wake, catching the light of the chandelier. She didn't look like a woman who had just been ordered to stay. She looked like a woman preparing for war. Taehyun watched her, his breath hitching as she turned to face him, her expression a mix of fierce love and unrelenting iron. "You call this protection?" she asked, her voice echoing off the glass walls that overlooked the sprawling, dangerous city below. "You hide your wounds, you hide your war, and you hide me. You've built a fortress out of silence, Taehyun, but you forgot one thing. A fortress without a second in command is just a very expensive prison." Taehyun reached for her, his bandaged arm a stark reminder of the violence he had tried to keep at bay. "I did it so you could keep your hands clean, Zaraya, so you could live in the light while I dealt with the dark. That was the deal." "Then the deal is dead," she countered, closing the distance between them until she was close enough to see the silver flecks of exhaustion in his dark eyes. She reached up, her fingers sliding over the dragon tattoo on his neck, feeling the rapid, rhythmic thrum of his pulse. "I didn't marry a businessman, Taehyun. I didn't marry a man who sells electronics or manages real estate. I married a king. I married the head of the Gwangju syndicate, knowing exactly what kind of blood flows through your veins." She leaned in, her gaze pinning him with a clarity that made him recoil slightly. "So stop treating me like a citizen. Stop treating me like a subject who needs to be shielded from the truth of the realm. If the Jian cartel is coming for the crown, they are coming for mine too. You think you're being noble by leaving me in the dark, but you're just leaving me unarmed." Taehyun's jaw tightened, his fingers twitching at his sides. The weight of his noble lie was finally crumbling under the sheer force of her will. For years, he had operated on the assumption that Zaraya was the one thing he had to keep pure, the one part of his life that remained untouched by the Gwangju underworld. He realized now that by doing so, he had made her a stranger in her own home. "The docks are a mess, Zaraya," he rasped, his voice cracking. "It's not just the 12 men, they've frozen our shipping routes. They're squeezing the life out of our logistics. If I don't break their hold by the end of the week, the other families will see it as a sign of weakness. They'll descend like vultures." "Then we break them," Zaraya said, her voice dropping into a low, lethal register that sent a different kind of shiver down Taehyun's spine. "But we do it together. No more messages through Mr. Park, no more separate bedrooms, and definitely no more glass walls between us. I want to see the ledgers. I want to know who is on our payroll and who has been bought by the Geons. You have the muscle, Taehyun, but you've been fighting this like a soldier. It's time you started fighting it like a dynasty." She reached for the lapels of his black suit, pulling him down until their foreheads touched. The sapphire of her dress shimmered in the low light, no longer a provocation, but a banner. "I am Zaraya Kwon," she whispered against his lips, "and I am done being a ghost in your palace. Either you let me into the dark with you, or you'll find that a king without his queen is a very easy target." Taehyun let out a long, shuddering breath, the tension that had held him upright for 30 days finally giving way to a raw, newfound strength. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her so tight she could feel the cold metal of his watch against her back and the heat of his heart against her chest. The silence was officially broken, and as he buried his face in her natural curls, he knew that the Jian cartel had no idea that the most dangerous person in the Kwon family wasn't the man with the gun. It was the woman in the royal blue dress. The heavy, stagnant air of the foyer finally broke as Taehyun reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he intertwined his fingers with Zaraya. The gold door handle, once the focus of her desperate escape, was now just a cold piece of metal behind them. Without a word, he led her away from the entrance and toward the grand staircase, his stride no longer the rigid march of a soldier, but the purposeful movement of a man returning home after a long, weary exile. The ascent was silent, yet for the first time in 30 days, the quiet didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like a bridge. As they reached the upper landing, Taehyun bypassed the door to the guest suite, the room that had served as his self-imposed prison, and stopped before the heavy mahogany double doors of their master suite. He paused for a heartbeat, his thumb tracing circles against the back of Zaraya's hand before pushing the doors open. The room was exactly as she had left it, bathed in the soft, amber glow of the recessed lighting, smelling of her perfume and the expensive vanilla candles she favored. But to Zaraya, it felt like stepping into a different dimension. The physical barrier was gone, and as the doors clicked shut behind them, the emotional walls came tumbling down with a roar only they could hear. Tihyun didn't let go of her hand. He pulled her into the center of the room, the royal blue silk of her dress shimmering like deep water under the moonlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He turned her to face him, his eyes searching hers with a raw vulnerability that made her breath hitch. The king she had challenged downstairs was still there, but he had laid down his crown at her feet. "I've spent every night for a month standing outside this door," he whispered, his voice thick with the weight of 30 wasted nights. "I would reach for the handle, convinced that if I turned it, I would find the room empty, that the silence in the hallway was just a preview of the silence in my life without you." Zaraya reached up, her fingers unknotting his black silk tie with slow, deliberate movements. She didn't stop until it fell to the plush carpet, followed by his suit jacket. She placed her palms against his chest, feeling the heat of his skin through the thin fabric of his shirt. "You were never alone, Tihyun. I was on the other side of that door, waiting for the man who promised to never let me go to remember who he was." He let out a jagged breath, burying his face in the crook of her neck, his inhale sharp and desperate as he breathed in the scent of her natural curls. His arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against him, his touch possessive yet reverent. The royal blue dress, the provocation that had started the night, now felt like a relic of a past life. "I'm done pretending," he murmured against her skin, the vibration of his voice sending a familiar electric heat through her limbs. "The geons, the docks, the letters. None of it matters if I lose the ground I stand on. And you are my ground, Zaraya. You always have been." Zaraya pulled back just enough to look at him, her smoky eyes soft but determined. She reached for the zipper at the back of her gown, her gaze never leaving his. "Then show me. No more assistance, no more separate wings, and no more lies, even the ones told for protection." As the silk dress pooled at her feet in a sapphire wave, Tihyun didn't look at her with the cold hunger of a stranger. He looked at her with the deep, abiding recognition of a man who had finally found his way back to the only light he had ever known. He scooped her up, his movements fluid and strong, and carried her toward the bed they had shared for 6 years. A territory reclaimed, a sanctuary restored. The 30-day war was over. In the quiet of their shared suite, as the city lights painted shadows across their intertwined bodies, the silence was no longer a tomb. It was a promise. The Gwangju Syndicate could wait. The Geon Cartel could wait. Tonight, there were no glass walls, only the rhythmic, unified beating of 2 hearts that had survived the storm, stronger for the wreckage they had left behind. The morning sun bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the master suite, but the warmth in the room didn't come from the light. It came from the weight of Tihyun's arm draped over Zaraya's waist, a solid, grounding presence that hadn't been there for a month. The silence had been broken, but the war remained, and as Zaraya watched the dust motes dance in the light, she knew the king needed more than just a wife this morning. He needed a partner who wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty in the ink of the law. They didn't retreat to separate wings for breakfast. Instead, they sat at the small marble table in the suite's private lounge, a laptop and a stack of leather-bound ledgers sitting between their coffee cups. Tihyun had finally laid the cards on the table, showing her the stranglehold the Geon Cartel had on their logistics. They weren't just using guns, they were using shell companies and maritime liens to freeze the Kwon shipping routes. "They're smart," Tihyun admitted, his thumb tracing the dragon tattoo on his neck as he stared at a list of frozen assets. "They've buried the ownership of these blockades in 3 different jurisdictions. My usual methods, the muscle, the bribes, they aren't working because I can't find a single throat to squeeze." Zaraya leaned forward, her voluminous curls tied back in a practical knot, her eyes sharp with a different kind of fire than the one from the night before. She pulled a ledger toward her fingers flying across the keys of the laptop as she tapped into the databases she hadn't touched since she left Marseille. Before she was Zaraya Kwon, she was a Moro, a name that carried its own weight in the halls of international maritime law and European diplomacy. "You're looking at this like a soldier, T. Hyun," she said, her voice cool and analytical. "You're looking for a person to fight, but the Geons aren't fighting you with men right now, they're fighting you with paperwork, and paperwork is where I was born." She pointed to a string of registration numbers for a cargo fleet, currently idling in the international waters off Jeju. These vessels are registered under a Panamanian flag, but the holding company is tied to a French logistics firm. Because of the new EU-Korea trade directives my family helped lobby for last year, there's a transparency loophole. If we can prove that the beneficial owner of these firms has ties to designated criminal entities, we don't need a judge to unfreeze your roots. We just need to trigger an anti-money laundering audit. T. Hyun watched her, a look of profound realization dawning on his face. He had spent years trying to keep her away from the darkness, never realizing that her light, her education, her lineage, her sharp legal mind, was the very thing that could pierce through the Geon cartel's shadows. "If we trigger an audit," T. Hyun murmured, leaning in closer until their shoulders touched, "it freezes their liquid assets. They won't be able to pay their port fees or their mercenaries." "Exactly," Zaraya smiled, a predatory edge to her expression. "While they're busy answering to the French Maritime Authority and the Korean Financial Intelligence Unit, they won't have time to worry about the docks in Gwangju. We don't just break the hold, T. Hyun. We bankrupt the strategy." The dragon on T. Hyun's neck seemed to pulse with a dark satisfaction. He reached out, taking her hand, the same hand he had once tried to keep clean, and kissed her knuckles. "I spent 6 years trying to make sure you never had to see this side of my life, and in one morning, you've done more damage to the Geons than my entire security detail did in a month." "I told you," Zaraya whispered, leaning over to press a brief, firm kiss to his lips. "Stop treating me like a citizen. I'm a Moro by blood and a Kwon by choice. Let's show the Geons what happens when you try to cage a queen." By the time the coffee was cold, the first set of digital files had been sent to Marseille. The glass walls of the penthouse no longer felt like a prison. They felt like an observation deck, and as T. Hyun began making calls to his captains, Zaraya sat beside him, her legal briefs open and her resolve absolute. The Gwangju Syndicate was no longer a one-man army. It was a dynasty, and for the first time in 30 days, the ghost of Seoul wasn't haunting the halls, he was planning a conquest. The grand hall of the Shilla was a sea of monochromatic suits and hushed, lethal whispers. This was neutral ground, the kind of place where the underworld met to negotiate peace or declare total war. Every major head of the Gwangju families was present, their eyes darting toward the empty chairs at the head of the long, obsidian table. The air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the sharp, metallic tang of tension. The Geon cartel leaders sat smugly at the far end, convinced that the month of silence from the Kwon penthouse was a sign of a crumbling empire. Then, the heavy oak doors swung open. T. Hyun entered first, but he didn't walk alone. He didn't leave his wife 3 paces behind him like a protected secret. Instead, Zaraya walked at his side, her hand resting firmly in the crook of his arm. She was still wearing the royal blue gown, the same provocation from the night their silence broke, but it no longer looked like an invitation. It looked like a banner of war. The sapphire silk shimmered under the crystal chandeliers, a bold, defiant splash of color in a room of shadows. A collective intake of breath swept through the hall. This wasn't the ghost the rumors had whispered about. This was a queen. As they reached the table, T. Hyun didn't pull out a chair for her to sit in a corner. He pulled out the chair directly to his right, the seat traditionally reserved for the second in command. The Geon patriarch narrowed his eyes, his gaze flickering from Zaraya's calm, regal expression to the dragon tattoo pulsing on T. Hyun's neck. "I wasn't aware this was a family dinner, Kwon," the elder Geon sneered, leaning forward. We are here to discuss the maritime blockades, business, not domestic distractions. Hyun didn't flinch. He leaned back, his posture relaxed yet predatory, his hand covering Zaraya on the table in a public display of unity that silenced the room. Then it's a good thing my wife is the one who drafted the response to your blockades, he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Zaraya. Zaraya didn't wait for permission. She slid a sleek silver tablet across the obsidian surface toward the Geon leadership. Her voice was steady, infused with the cold, legal precision of the Mara lineage. As of 2 hours ago, the French Maritime Authority has placed a temporary freeze on every vessel associated with your Panamanian shell companies. Since your liquid assets are tied to those logistics, the Korean Financial Intelligence Unit has flagged your primary accounts for an anti-money laundering audit. The smugness evaporated from the Geon patriarch's face, replaced by a pale, twitching fury. You have no authority. I have the law, Zaraya interrupted, her smoky eyes flashing with an unbreakable iron. And my husband has the docks. If you want your ships to move again, you will withdraw your mercenaries from the Gwangju perimeter by dawn. Otherwise, the Moreau family's legal ties in Marseille will ensure those ships rot in international waters until your empire is nothing but a memory. The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time in history, the syndicate saw the Kwon power not as a solitary man with a gun, but as a unified dynasty. Hyun looked at Zaraya, his eyes filled with a pride so fierce it was almost tangible. He had spent years trying to shield her from the darkness, never realizing she was the one who could master it. The blockades are over, Hyun stated, his voice final as he stood up. He didn't wait for a rebuttal. He turned to Zaraya, offering his hand. As they walked out of the hall, the royal blue dress trailing behind her like a regal wake, the families parted like the Red Sea. They weren't just a couple anymore, they were an untouchable front. Outside, the night air was cool and crisp, the city lights of Gwangju sprawling before them like a conquered kingdom. Hyun stopped her by the car, pulling her close one last time. He brushed a stray curl away from her face, his thumb lingering on the line of her jaw. I told you that you weren't leaving the house tonight, he murmured, a shadow of a smile playing on his lips. I didn't leave, Zaraya whispered, leaning into his touch. I just took my seat. As the car pulled away into the shimmering neon of the city, the ghost of Seoul was gone. In his place was a king who no longer fought in silence, and beside him sat the queen who had turned his gilded cage into a throne. They had survived the storm, not by hiding from it, but by becoming the storm itself.